Welcome to SK to the Point. And today I would like to have an in depth conversation, or rather an exploration, of the current diplomatic crisis involving India, Canada, and the United States. It's a saga that is basically involving covert operations, espionage, and international relations. The exposure of India's alleged involvement in two assassination plots targeting pro Khalistan separatist leaders has cast a shadow in the diplomatic relations. We'll be discussing the alleged assassination plots targeting Sikh separatist leaders, how India's covert operations came to light, and what it all means for international relations between the three nations. We'll also explore why covert operations, once exposed, can spiral into geopolitical crisis, eroding trust and complicating global partnerships. Our story begins with the assassination of Hardeep Singh Nijjar in June 2023. He was a Sikh separatist leader advocating for Khalistan, and he was shot dead outside a Sikh temple in British Columbia in Canada. Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau accused Indian government agents of orchestrating the assassination, citing credible evidence. This accusation marked the beginning of a long diplomatic rift between India and Canada. For India, Nijjar was not merely a political activist, but a terrorist advocating separatism and violence against the Indian state. It is well documented that India had long warned Canada about harboring pro Khalistan extremists, and this issue had been a source of tension for quite a long time. Canada, on the other hand, views the Khalistan movement through the lens of freedom of speech, complicating efforts to reconcile the perspectives. The allegations of India's involvement in the assassination represent a breach of Canada's sovereignty and have set off series of retaliatory actions, including the expulsion of diplomats from both the countries. Things became even more complicated when US prosecutors revealed another alleged Indian plot, this time targeting Gurpatwant Singh Pannun, a prominent Sikh separatist leader again, based in the United States. According to US authorities, Indian government officials, including one Mr. Vikash Yadav, were involved in a murder for hire plot to kill Panon. Nikhil Gupta, who is said to be a co-conspirator, was arrested and charged with orchestrating the plot under Yadav's directions. Interestingly, the operation was foiled when Gupta's hired assassin turned out to be an FBI informant. Vikash Yadav is said to have played a role in both these assassination plots, and it has raised serious questions about India's approach to extraterritorial operations. The fact that US and Canadian authorities uncovered these operations speaks to a failure of intelligence management and execution from the Indian side. In the world of espionage, plausible deniability is crucial. Once that is lost, the operation not only fails but also creates a major diplomatic headache for the country involved. The Pannun plot, like the Nijjar killing, has triggered diplomatic tensions between India and the United States. While the US values its strategic partnership with India, particularly in the Indo Pacific, the exposure of such plots on American soil forces the Washington to address these. And the fact that the United States has chosen to address these concerns publicly gives a very interesting perspective to this whole incident. This has now put India in a precarious situation, needing to manage its relations with the US while also facing the increasing scrutiny over its covert operations abroad. Let's now take a closer look at India's covert intelligence activities, particularly through its foreign intelligence agency, the RAW, or the Research and Analysis Wing. RAW is responsible for safeguarding India's national interests, both domestically and internationally. RAW is typically known for conducting clandestine operations targeting extremist groups abroad. However, covert operations rely on secrecy and secrecy alone. Their very nature is to operate in the shadows, unknown to the broader public and especially to foreign governments. The issue India now faces is that its alleged involvement in the Nijjar killing was not just exposed, it has also become the center of a major diplomatic storm. It is the same with the Pannun's alleged assassination plot as well. Covert operations, by their nature, must remain deniable, allowing the government to distance itself from any potential blowback. The exposure of Raw's alleged involvement in the assassination of Nijjar has shattered this deniability, leaving India vulnerable to international criticism and strained relations. The problem is, once an operation like this becomes public, it triggers consequences beyond the immediate scope of the mission. In this case, it has upended India's relationship with Canada and created ripples in its relationship with the United States, another key player in the evolving saga. In the Pannun plot, US authorities indicted Vikash Yadav, a former Indian government employee and senior field officer of RAW, for orchestrating the plot alongside his associate Nikhil Gupta. Here's what the official release from the United States says. So Vikash Yadav was not only a high-ranking member of the RAW, but also had previously served in the CRPF, giving him extensive experience in intelligence and paramilitary operations. Nikhil Gupta, who is said to be his co-conspirator, was tasked with finding a hitman to carry out the assassination. He eventually hired an individual he believed to be a criminal associate, but he eventually turned out to be an FBI informant. Nikhil Gupta, who is an Indian national, was detained in Prague in June last year by the FBI and extradited to New York for his alleged involvement in the Pannun assassination plot. In August 2024, Nikhil Gupta was interviewed by the Sunday Guardian and he had a lot to say about his arrest. He is currently in the US custody and describes his imprisonment as traumatic, referring to his detention center, MDC Brooklyn, as a slaughterhouse. He says so because he finds the place to be really, really violent. He also recounts several violent incidents, including stabbing and murders, and says his request for relocation and legal representation have been ignored. Nikhil Gupta, in the interview, denies all charges, insisting he is innocent, and claims the accusations were politically motivated, designed to affect Indian elections and damage his reputation. We have to understand that all of this happened last year, so he was referring to the 2024 general elections in India. Nikhil Gupta also believes that he's being used as a pawn in a larger agenda aimed at defaming India, arguing that his involvement is part of a broader political strategy. He also mentions how his family has been abandoned, receiving no help or communication from the Indian government or officials, and pleads for support, claiming his innocence. According to the US prosecutors, Vikash Yadav provided Nikhil Gupta with detailed personal information about Pannun, including his home address and phone numbers. Nikhil Gupta was allegedly offered around 100,000 USD for the job, with 15,000 USD paid as advance. And like I said earlier, the plan collapsed when the informant tipped off the FBI, leading to Nikhil Gupta's arrest and Vikash Yadav's identification as a key figure behind the operation. Vikash Yadav's role in the Pannun assassination plot and also the Nijjar assassination underscores the high level of coordination and the intent behind these operations. Yet, while Mossad and the CIA have successfully executed such operations while keeping a low profile, the exposure of Raw's involvement in these plots represents a serious intelligence failure. Some of the intelligence specialists and ex-intelligence officials that I've been speaking to say that the recent mishaps and the messes that may have happened, not necessarily referring to both Nijjar and Pannun operations specifically, could be down to unverified outsourcing of critical operations to agents or hitmen who may be double agents or who may be people who end up tipping off other agencies. While in the interview to Sunday Guardian, Nikhil Gupta did not offer much in terms of his involvement in the assassination plot. It is very likely that if he was not all that innocent, he may have spilled a lot of beans to the FBI and the American agencies in terms of his handlers, the contacts, and the assignment as well. In terms of the overall incident, I think this is of course not the first time that we've seen countries conduct extraterritorial operations. Intelligence agents like the CIA and the Mossad have long operated in the shadows, neutralizing threats to national security outside their borders. Mossad, for instance, carried out the assassination of key members of Black September responsible for the Munich Olympics massacre. It was also involved with the abduction of West German rocket scientist, while the CIA has been involved in operations to assassinate Fidel Castro in the past. We also know that the CIA was involved in the actual killing of Osama bin Laden in Pakistan, but also involved and responsible for the removal of Congo's first Prime Minister, Patrice Lumumba. But here's where India's position differs. When the CIA or the Mossad carry out operations, they often have immense leverage over the countries involved, even when things go wrong. In some cases, operations are covered up through diplomatic means or quiet deals between governments. These agencies have the backing of powerful nations that can weather the diplomatic storm. They also have the global political and economical clout to prevent these incidents from causing long term damage to relationships. India, however, lacks this same level of leverage, especially with the US or Canada. When Ross covert operations become public knowledge, as they did with Nijjar's assassination, India doesn't have the same kind of geopolitical shield. This basically puts India at a disadvantage and highlights a need for more careful planning and execution in the future. Another important thing to note here is that USA and Canada going after India publicly only shows the hypocrisy that the Western nations bring with them. Also, the fact that they have completely chosen to ignore the death threats given to Indian diplomats, the threats given to blow up the planes, shows that the rule of law is not the same across situations and contexts. Or rather, it applies only when a citizen of the Western world is at the receiving end. I think we all can agree on one fact: terrorism is terrorism, wherever it occurs and to whoever it occurs. The assassination plots targeting Nijjar and Pannun have had serious diplomatic consequences. In Canada, for instance, the fallout has been severe. Both countries have expelled diplomats, and tensions have escalated to a point where trust between the two governments is at an all time low. It won't be a surprising thing to say that India probably enjoys a better diplomatic relationship with Pakistan right now than Canada. Canada views India's alleged actions as a violation of its sovereignty, while India accuses Canada of harboring extremists that threaten its national security. This standoff has strained a relationship that until recently has been marked by strong economic and educational ties. It could sound cliched and it could be an argument that's used very frequently, especially when you are talking about Justin Trudeau, but of course, as a leader, he will have to cater to his minority votes, considering the majority do not look too impressed with him in the recent months, given his own reputation with regards to accusations of China's interference in Canadian election. In a popularity survey taken last year, Ontario and British Columbia had the highest approvals for Justin Trudeau, which also has a considerable minority population. Canadian opposition leader and Conservative Party chief Pierre Poilievre recently challenged Prime Minister Justin Trudeau to release the names of his party members, whom the latter claimed were involved in foreign interference in Canadian politics. This was a response to Justin Trudeau's remarks while speaking before the Foreign Interference Commission, which is investigating the role of foreign actors in Canada's federal election. Appearing before the Independent Commission, Justin Trudeau suggested that Canadian intelligence agencies had information that a number of conservative politicians were engaged in or at risk from foreign interference attempts. However, interestingly, Canada's Global News reported that Justin Trudeau admitted that the list of names also included Liberal politicians, his own party, as well as those from other parties. Justin Trudeau later did not expand on what the parliamentarians being referred to were suspected of doing. In the US, the situation is equally delicate. The US has made it clear that while it values its partnership with India, it cannot tolerate assassination plots being conducted on American soil. The exposure of the Pannun plot has forced Washington to publicly address the issue, complicating its strategic partnership with India at a time when both nations are collaborating closely to counterbalance China in the Indo-Pacific. For the US, the challenge is to maintain its alliance with India without turning a blind eye to such covert activities. India, for its part, has tried to distance itself from these allegations. The Ministry of External Affairs confirmed that Vikash Yadav, the alleged mastermind of the Pannun plot, is no longer employed by the Indian government. However, this has done very little to ease tensions between the two countries, as both the US and Canada continue to push for further investigations and accountability from India. So here's the critical point. While the US has so far managed its public response carefully, there is some underlying concern. As India grows stronger on the world stage, especially in areas of defense and intelligence, the US may not want to see India becoming too powerful when it comes to covert operations. The US, as the world's dominant power, obviously has a vested interest in maintaining control over international intelligence operations. If India begins conducting operations with the same audacity as the CIA or the Mossad, it could challenge US's monopoly over the extraterritorial actions. By exposing India's involvement in both the Nijjar and the Pannun cases, the US could be subtly signaling that it's willing to let India grow in influence, but only up to a point. Covert operations are seen as the purview of the most powerful nations, and the US may be reminding India of its place in the global pecking order. If India wishes to become a major player in the covert intelligence game, it must do so with more sophistication and caution than it has shown in these two cases. I think it's very important to remember this. The delicate balance of international relationship often hinges on the immediate needs and priorities of nation, as we've clearly seen with other games involving major nations. Example, the case of Jamal Khashoggi involving USA and the Saudi Arabia. We all know what happened there and how it ended. The Western media has played a significant role in shaping public opinion around these events, and it's important to consider how this fits into the broader geopolitical picture. Media outlets in the West, particularly in the US and Canada, have a history of presenting narratives that align with their government's foreign policy interests, unlike India. The coverage of India's alleged involvement in these assassinations has largely framed India as the aggressor, with little context about the Khalistan movement or its violent past. By emphasizing India's supposed overreach, the media may be towing a line that serves to undermine India's aspirations on the global stage. The focus on India's covert operations rather than the security threats that justify such actions shifts the narrative away from India's legitimate concerns about separatism and terrorism. This, too, could be a part of a broader strategy by Western powers to ensure that India doesn't grow too bold in its intelligence operations. I think it's very important to remember that it's not just about the operations themselves, but how they are framed and perceived on the world stage. I think it's interesting to see that these incidents also raise important questions about the international law. I think we all can accept that extrajudicial killings, especially on foreign soil, are a violation of international norms, and they can put countries like India in a precarious position. Both the US and Canada, of course, have a responsibility to protect their citizens, even those deemed terrorists by foreign organizations or governments, and any breach of that duty can result in serious diplomatic fallout. So, what can India learn from all of this? Firstly, it's of course clear that covert operations need to be conducted with utmost discretion. The CIA and the Mossad are successful not just because they carry out high stakes operations, but because they do so while maintaining plausible deniability. India's exposure in both the Nijjar and Pannun cases demonstrate that its intelligence apparatus needs to be far more cautious and sophisticated. It's also important to understand that this is not the first time that such kind of exposures have happened, and in recent past we've seen outlets like Washington Post also make numerous allegations about India's covert operations abroad. Secondly, India must be aware of the geopolitical implications of its actions. As it continues to rise in power, India will face greater scrutiny from the US and its allies. India must navigate these waters very carefully, ensuring that its covert operations do not jeopardize its broader diplomatic and strategic goals. The risks of exposure, as we've seen, can lead to a significant diplomatic fallout that far outweighs the immediate benefits of the overall operation itself. And I think the most important question that will determine the result of this entire episode is if India will accept America's request to extradite Vikash Yadav to USA. It is something that India will, of course, look to avoid and get the US to settle for some kind of a public acknowledgement rather than hand over Vikash to the US. And trust me, handing over Vikash to the US will only lead to more leaks and embarrassment for India. One may say that it could be similar to what the US did and offered in terms of David Headley in 2010, when Indian officials were only granted access to him in the US and he was never brought to India and tried. It is also a very important aspect for the Narendra Modi government to maintain its head held high and not be succumbing to international pressure. Such a thing can help him stake claim to a moral victory of sorts in terms of maintaining India's sovereignty and stature in the global diplomacy space. In conclusion, I think India's recent involvement in extraterritorial operations has thrust it into the limelight in ways it may not have anticipated. While India has every right to protect its national security, especially from threats like the Khalistan movement, the fallout from these failed covert missions highlights the delicate balance between intelligence work and diplomacy. The lesson, of course, is very clear. If India wants to operate on the same levels as agencies like the CIA or the Mossad, it must refine its covert capabilities. The stakes are high and the consequences of failure are even higher. These events serve as a reminder that the world of covert operations is as much about secrecy as it is about strategy. When covert operations are exposed, they become diplomatic disasters. India, as an emerging global power, must learn from these mistakes and ensure that its future operations remain hidden even from the eyes of the most powerful allies. Thank you once again for tuning into SK to the Point. If you have any thoughts on India's role in these recent events or how the US and Canada have responded, please do leave your comments below. I will see you all again for more in depth analysis of global geopolitical issues. Until then, stay safe and see you soon.